posted already. Looks like you guys have taken a good bit of effort into changing some things. So thank you for that. But with the scene that we have here, so if we hit play, we want to make sure that, of course, it still has our animation, so that when we render out, we actually see our full sequence here. So of course we want to keep in mind where we're actually going to be rendering things. Of course I've done this before, so I do have some renders here, but I'm going to show you the whole process from beginning to end here, just so you can sort of see the process that I would go through. So again, making sure that our scene has animation, we want to make sure to come up to our render settings. So shortcut for this is Control B, and depending on your layout, let's see, startup layout, and then standard layout. Yeah, so on the default layout, at least in this version of C4D, top right here is where you can go to get to your render settings. And then up here, we want to make sure that if we're rendering animation, like what we did in our previous class, that we set up our frame range to be all the frames that we actually want to render. Now in this case, it's actually all of our frames. But it could be a subset of frames. We could maybe only want frame, 50 to 90, or, whatever the actual number is. But for this case, all frames actually works for the scene that I actually have set up here. And then the other thing that I want to make sure on this one is that I have my save path selected. So right now I don't have it going anywhere to save, but I do want it to go somewhere, so I'm going to make sure that my render goes where I want it to go. So let me bring up my menu here and give it a second to respond to me. There we go. So I'm just going to make a new folder here and name it today's date. Of course, you can have the structure that you like, and I'm just going to name this GB_01 just for my initials here, just so I know what it is. So like that, now I have my file save path selected. So right up here, this is the full path of where it's going into for my folder here. Yours would obviously be unique to you. I do suggest putting it in a folder because that'll make it a little bit more organized rather than rendering 90 frames to your desktop. But I leave it up to you to decide sort of what's the best sort of file organization system for you. And then down here, there are a couple other options that we can select, and some of these I might go into more detail when I do sort of the breakdown of projects if we have time for them. But you can usually leave most of these alone, for now at least. I would suggest choosing PNG for what we're going to be doing right now, because we're going to be making sure to render our project without any background. And that's so that I can change the background later on. Now, in my scene here, I do have this sort of custom background here, but maybe I want to change this later on. Maybe, a client might come to me and say they don't like my checkerboard pattern. That happens all the time. So being able to render on alpha, even if we do have a background in our scene, will allow us to change the background later on. So I can actually leave this on because a background element actually gets ignored by the alpha when you actually have it turned on here. So making sure that I have alpha channel turned on is a key thing to have in case I needed to change things later on. And then there are a bunch of other settings here that you can modify depending on what you need to do, such as we've talked about before, such as like an object buffer or ambient occlusion, which is something we've used before. But for this scene here, I don't have any of that enabled. So I'm just going to make sure to save my scene. And now you have a couple different options. You can either render to the picture viewer, or you can add to the render queue. Both of these will work out and they will save your images. One does it as a foreground process, and one does it as a background process. So if you use what's up here at the top named render and then add to render queue, this will actually add it to a list, and these ones. This will actually add it to a list here, and you can actually queue these up, and you can keep working in Cinema 4D and render to the picture viewer at the same time. Now, I will caution that if your computer isn't really good, or it's on the slower side of things, you might not want to do this and have two things going at the same time, but it is an option that you can do. It'll also give you an estimate of how long it's actually going to take. Or you can come up here to the top, go render the picture viewer, and you'll see that now it's actually going to render out my sequence here. So it's going to go through all the frames in my scene, so from 0 to 90 in this case, and it's going to render out these frames. And if I go into my folder here, you'll see that it's actually adding the frames as it renders it out. Now, I'm rendering this out because I have this scene set up to be a pretty fast render. If you've added a lot of cool materials and texture and have added global illumination, ambient occlusion, and all of that fun stuff, your render will take longer. So this is where you really need to be able to plan out and see how long your render is going to take so that you can actually get it done in the time that you actually have. So another thing that's very important in 3D is being able to manage your time, because you might run up towards a deadline where you only have, a couple hours to get a project done, but it might take, 4 hours to render your whole thing out. So you have to figure out how to deal with those different situations. And there are different ways, such as like render farms and multiple computers, but all those have to be kept in mind. So now if I go to my scene here and I click on one of these files, if my preview here would actually work, do it this way then. So now you can see that I have my file rendered out here, and if I hit the right arrow, you can see that even in my preview window here, I can sort of play my animation out. So this is how we would go about rendering out our animation out of C4D, which is pretty much a recap of what we've done last time. So now comes the part where we need to actually build this animation. Now, of course, if we did everything perfectly fine in Cinema 4D and we didn't need to change anything, then this would be totally fine. And in theory, if we were very brave, we could render a MP4, which some people have mentioned before. But usually that is not the case, and it's not recommended because your renders can have issues when you're rendering out the video and it could become corrupted. Computers aren't quite that foolproof yet. But if we render out a sequence, we can get around some of those issues. So what this means is that now we have to bring our sequence back together. So if you're using After Effects or another video program that allows you to import image sequences, Photoshop also does this as well, you can actually bring these into your program, and then you're able to modify and tweak them to your own design, which is what I'm going to ask you to do for our next in-class part here, which is simply just going to be to render out as much as you can of your sequence, and put it into a program and then render it out as a video or a GIF. So what I'll do here is I'm going to load up After Effects, and any version of After Effects can work for this, or if you like using Premiere Pro, you could do this in that as well. This demo obviously will be focusing on After Effects here. So what I can do here is I need to be able to import my sequence into After Effects and to have it read as a sequence of images. So inside of After Effects here, there's a bunch of different ways you can go about this. You can go to File, Import, File, or you could go right click onto this project window over here in the side and go Import, Import File, or you can even just double tap here and find your file that way as well. So I'm going to copy and paste my path here. And if I select my first image here, I can see down here at the bottom that it recognizes that it's a PNG sequence. If this is not turned on, you need to make sure that it's turned on, otherwise it'll only import one image. And if I double tap this now, you can see that it's going to import into my scene. Now, it looks like it got a little bit funky with my color profile here because this doesn't look quite how it looked inside my scene here. So what I think I actually need to do is hit Control K. Oh no, wrong shortcut. I need to go to File, let's see, Project Settings. And in this case, oh, that's interesting. I think I have linear turned on by default. Okay, so in my case, because I have multiple different workflows or color workflows that I have in my scene, I actually had to change my project's color profile settings. So you might not have to do this in yours, but if you do, you'll know that you have to go to File, Project Settings, and then go into Color. And on mine, I had linearized workflow turned on. I need to turn that off. And then it actually gave me the colors that I have inside my C4D. So now that I have this set up, I can hit the RAM preview button in my scene, and it'll render out my scene as I had it intended in After Effects. Now, the benefit of doing it this way is now, if I want to add a solid in my scene or a background, I could go to right click down here at the bottom, New, Solid. Maybe I make this red just so that it's super blaring. And I layer this behind my logo that I've rendered. And now I have a red background in my scene. And now I can apply different effects to this. So not a crazy After Effects tutorial here, but if I search for maybe gradient and add a 4-color gradient to my scene, now you can see that I have this 4-color gradient on the background of my scene here, and I can do different things with this. Or let's say I wanted to add text to my scene. I could come up to my window and go to my character palette, which is actually already open here. So I can go to the right side of my menu here, go to text at the top of my scene. So up here, if you're not familiar, are the menu items that you can add for different elements inside of After Effects. I can go to my horizontal type tool and type Greg, maybe for my full name here. And I can put that at the sort of bottom right of my scene. So now people know that this is my project and I have this awesome text on here. So like this, you can add different effects to this. Maybe, you know, I want this to sort of glow. So let's see if I got any cool glow effects here. There we go. So now I have my logo here being a little bit glowy compared to what it was before. So now that I'm super happy with my glowing sort of quad color background with my text at the bottom, now I could say add this to the render queue inside of After Effects, which would be, well, first of all, I'm going to save my project because I know things can crash and I would like to be able to keep my awesome artwork here. So I'm going to actually save my scene file. So I can come back to it later on. So now that I have this saved, now I can add this to the render queue inside of After Effects, which if you're not familiar with that, you can access that by coming up to the top and going to Composition and going to either add the render queue or add to media encoder queue. I'll just do render queue for now. And down here at the bottom, you can actually choose or create your own sort of presets. The codec that you use for this case in this class isn't really important, although when you're posting to social media, you will have to keep in mind the codec. Usually you want to use something such as like MP4. It's usually most people are using these days at least. And then I also want to make sure that I can choose a location. So the output path here will let me choose a location, and I'm just going to render it to my main folder here. Hit save. So right now my file name is named gp_01. And now that I am comfortable with my render settings, my output module settings, my file name, my beautiful glowing image here with my name on the bottom and my custom background on the and behind it. I can come over here to the bottom right side, and I have two options. I have render and Q in AME, which means Adobe Media Encoder. But I'm just going to choose the first one, hit render. And if you hear that sound, you know that hopefully it's rendered out. So now I have my video here, and if I double tap it and bring over my window, you can see that it rendered out my animation. And this is something that I could submit as a completed sort of version of my animation here. So a bunch of different steps there, and this is definitely one of the methods if you're more familiar with After Effects, which is one of the industry standard compositing programs. Although there are others, so if you are more comfortable using a different program for doing your sort of compositing work, I encourage you to use it. As long as I get a video file in the end, that's totally acceptable for in this case here. So that's how you would do it for After Effects. Again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. I am recording these, so of course, if you missed anything or you didn't see what button I hit or anything like that, please feel free to check over the video, and of course, shoot me an email if you need more help as well. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how to do the same exact thing in Photoshop as well. Of course, since we are doing one of the options that you have is to actually make a GIF and post it on Giphy. It would make sense to be able to know how to make GIFs. Now, if you are doing it using After Effects, you can actually render out GIFs from After Effects or from Adobe Media Encoder specifically. You can actually queue in Adobe AME, and when it loads, you can actually choose a GIF option as a preset. So on the bottom here, underneath GIF, there's actually a GIF animated sequence preset, and you can actually add that. And if I were to hit play in Adobe Media Encoder, which is right up here, now it's going to do the same thing it did in After Effects. I do find that Adobe Media Encoder is slower, but it does have its benefits as well. So now that that's done, if I go back into my folder here, double tap this, you can see that very similar. I have a GIF that I can actually post as well. The quality will be different because you're making a GIF rather than a video. But you can see that that's one way that you can actually get a GIF, and this is what you could post on, say, Giphy for the extra credit for your animation assignment. Now, this was in After Effects via Adobe Media Encoder, and there are some settings if you click your preset settings in Adobe Media Encoder in order to sort of manipulate this, but there aren't that many. So depending on what you need to do, if you need more control over your actual GIF export, using Photoshop might be the preferred program to use. So I'm going to load up Photoshop here and show you how I would import the image sequence into Photoshop in order to achieve a similar effect. You can do video from Photoshop as well, but I would recommend against it because it's not as powerful or doesn't have as many options as you do inside of Adobe Media Encoder, although it does kind of use the same engine. But in Photoshop, if we go to File and we go to, say, Open, I need to find a folder that I have my image sequences in, and very similar to how we did inside of After Effects, I select the first frame and then I come down to where it says image sequence and make sure that this is turned on. By default, Photoshop does not know that you're working with an image sequence because it's not a video program. So make sure to turn on image sequence if you're trying to import your image sequence inside of Photoshop. So once you have that enabled, now I can click open, and it should give me a dialog that asks me what my frame rate is. So this should reflect the same thing that you had inside of Cinema 4D. So mine was 30, so I'm gonna make sure that it's 30 and click OK. And now that it's loaded up inside of Photoshop, I can hit play at the bottom left here. So down here I have to play. And now you should see that it plays out just like it did in After Effects, just like it did inside of Cinema 4D. So now the only thing that I have to do is figure out how to export it. And Photoshop is definitely what I use most of the time in terms of getting a good export, especially for GIF, because inside of Photoshop, if I come up here to File, and then there's an option for Export, and then Save for Web Legacy. And I'm going to let this load for a second. This gives me the option to export my animation with a lot more control over how my result actually looks. So there's a lot of different options here, but if you go into the presets up here at the top, you can see that I have GIF at a number of different numbers, and these numbers basically correlate to the amount of colors you can have exported. So I can choose 64, and you should see now my design here is sort of by default sort of minimalized so that you don't need that many colors. But if I say go to say 8 colors, you can see that some of the colors don't come through. So you need to have enough colors in order for your animation to look as good as you would like it to be. So in my case, 64 is enough because I optimized this so that it can have the least amount of colors. But it might depend on your actual animation or your actual render. So now that I have this set up, I can come down to save, and there are other options here that you might want to keep in mind, such as like looping forever or once. So if some of you have seen some of the GIFs that I have on Blackboard for the titles of the class and stuff like that, this is sort of how I was able to sort of control those in order to have them either loop forever or to loop one time. So now I can come down to save, and I can choose a folder. I could choose my desktop or anywhere like that, and I can save those out to wherever I needed to go. So that's how I would export it out of Photoshop. So 2 ways in order to export out your images, or your image sequence rather. You can either import into Photoshop and export it out as a GIF, or you can import into After Effects and you could render out as an MP4 or an MOV or a GIF or any other type of file format that a client might eventually request of you. So those are the ways that I would export out my images. So now that we have that here, what I'm going to give you the time to do for pretty much the rest of the class is I would like you to see how much of your image sequence you can render out. So I'm going to set a timer for 20 minutes or so, but I would just like you to see if you can render out your image sequence, or as much as you can, bring it into Photoshop or After Effects and add something. It could be anything. It could be your name at the bottom right corner. It could be a custom background. You could add a glow effect. It could be something super simple. It's really just to show the power that you can add different elements to your 3D after the fact. And then I'm going to ask you to render as an MP4, or if you're brave and you want to do a GIF, you can do that. Okay, I can help you with that. You could render an MP4 or a GIF. I'll give you either or options there. and then post it to the in-class Dropbox. And then after that, you can take a break, get some water or anything like that. So I'm just going to ask you to render out the image sequence as much as you can. You don't have to get the full image sequence out, since I know it can take a bit of time to actually do it, but I will set the timer for 20 minutes. And then just post it to the in-class Dropbox or the media file. So I'll put those links in the chat here. I think that's double posted, but that should work there. And just add any element to it. So you could add another element to it. You could render out another 3D element and add it on top of it after the fact. Any sort of elements there, totally acceptable for that. So I'm going to set the timer here, and then I'm going to let you go towards that. And again, if anyone has any questions with that while they're doing it, just let me know. And then I do see one question here about adding a formula effector. So if you're working with the formula effector, if you're using my scene file, which is totally cool and what I expect, make sure you have it in the right grouping. So if you're adding elements into your scene and you want it to be affected by the formula effector, make sure that you have it either in the group if you're using sort of the pan method that I have outlined here, or it has to be in a fracture element with the formula effector added to as an effect to it. So keep in mind where you're adding your elements into the scene if they're not moving. And if not, let me know and I can help you with that.